king was performing a routine inspection of the Paris National Guard. The guardsmen surprised him with impromptu cries of "Down with Villèle." When officers tried to establish order, one guardsman decided to go down in history as an absolute legend and punched his superior officer in the face right in front of the king. The officers completely lost control of the men.
Oh my gosh. The July Revolution by Historia Civilis. I saw this video like long time ago when it was released 2 weeks ago. I was like, oh, I'm gonna save this for a rainy day, and now it's here. Guys, I'm gonna keep saying this on all my videos. Link is gonna be in the description, man. Go check out what I'm wearing. I'm telling you, it's great, it's excellent. It's especially if you live in a cold country, this is so great. Check it out in the description, man.
The early 1820s had done the impossible. They had reintegrated themselves back into the international system as a great power. But in 1823, that all changed. For some reason, France recklessly invaded Spain, which brought the great powers to the brink of war and almost took down the international system. Why did France get like...
I remember that, and I wanted to see how that was going to end.
20% stupider in the 1820s? It's an important question, and to answer it, we will have to go back to where we left off with French politics. 1820, 3 years before France recklessly invaded Spain. The 1820s were when things really began to change in France, and it started when the nephew of the King of France was stabbed to death by a left-wing radical.
Whoa,
this event
okay.
sent shockwaves through French politics. The aristocracy and their allies in the French legislature, the ultra-conservatives, demanded immediate action. During the crisis, superstar politician Richelieu was brought back into government, and as prime minister, he pushed through a series of changes to the French electoral system. Up until now, the process had been that 1/5 of the legislators were elected every year, and the trend over the last 5 years had been that every year, the ultra-conservatives were losing ground to the centrists and the left-wing Republicans. With the assassination of the king's nephew, the ultra-conservatives were officially freaked out at the rise of the French left, and Richelieu was committed to stopping them from making any more electoral gains. Under the new system, 40% of the seats in the legislature would be elected by a select group of ultra-wealthy elites, who were a lot more conservative and pro-monarchy than the general public. That was precisely the point. The people around the king were getting worried about the mood of the public, so they just insulated themselves from public opinion. They came from the "maybe if I ignore my problems, they'll just go away" school of thought. They made elections a lot less frequent for the same reason. The thing about elections is that the more representative they are, the more stabilizing they are to the state. It forces governments to address problems early.
Really? A representative election where the representative actually works, or should I better say the representation actually works in wow. I swear I can't like take representative democracy seriously anymore, because I guess it's because I live in America for too long, and I personally just witnessed how the representatives absolutely do not represent the people here. So every time I hear the word representative and election, I'm just so turned off by it. I'm kind of low-key, I don't know. I guess it's the American form of democracy that I'm turned off by. I know that European democracies are a lot more different, really and truly, so I can't really say that I'm turned off by democracy in general. I think I'm just too used to a freaking American democracy.
Before they become existential threats. It gives opposition groups something productive to do. Would you rather have angry opposition groups handing out leaflets or stockpiling weapons? Which do you think is better for the long-term health of the state? But that only works if elections are fair. Without fair elections, groups are forced to get creative, and the probability of a rebellion or a civil war or a revolution increases.
Interesting.
So France's electoral reforms in 1820 made the French state more brittle, and they did this to insulate the king and his preferred ultra-conservatives from their own growing unpopularity. In my opinion, it was a stupid thing to do. But the ultra-conservatives didn't see it as stupid. In the next election under this new rigged electoral system, the ultra-conservatives won 85% of the seats in the French legislature, absolutely dominating every other group that voiced any opposition to the king's will.
Bruh, that's a problem with representative democracy. It's like, when you have a situation like this, like, I believe that in a democracy, there should always be like an opposition, like always, because yes, even if the people vote majority for a certain group, it's like that group essentially that could turn into something bad, real bad. I don't know. I'm like, should I explain this now? I don't know if I should explain this now. It's like 2 a.m. in the morning. But like, imagine, long story short, just like how these people support the king, guess what? There's no opposition to stop the king from doing as he pleases now. Now they support him. Now he can just pass a whole bunch of laws and nobody can't stop him. And in fact, actually, that is literally how they abolished the monarchy in my country. The opposition literally lost all the seats in the parliament by a democratic vote, and because of this, my freaking country turned into a de facto dictatorship because there was basically no opposition in the parliament, and the freaking left-wing government, who just likes to cry about slavery, even though that was 200 years ago, they just decided, oh, wait a minute, we control the entire parliament. Oh, let's just do a quote unquote vote in the parliament and just abolish the monarchy in a democratic way without consulting the people. And that's my point. That's why I don't like this style of democracy, actually, is because you can something like, oh bloody hell, something like that can just easily happen, and it's like, bro, what? Like, what in the world?
The ultra-conservatives thought that they had pulled off a soft coup. They thought that they had won. But it was all an illusion. Even with
really?
85% of the seats in the French legislature,
Really?
ultra-conservatives were still unpopular with the people.
With the people,
The electoral
okay.
reforms didn't fix that fundamental problem. It only concealed it. In fact, they had sown the seeds of their own destruction.
Could Kodiak...
With the huge ultra-conservative majority in the legislature, the centrist Prime Minister Richelieu was replaced by an extreme conservative named Villèle. And then a few years later, the Spanish liberals rose up to remove their autocratic king from power.
Again.
Villèle persuaded the King of France to invade. It's clear why Villèle felt threatened.
So they didn't let Napoleon, and now they don't like their king.
By this, right?
Interesting.
He was trying to reestablish autocratic rule in his own country, and he feared the French liberals doing in France what the Spanish liberals were doing in Spain.
That's called foreshadowing, baby.
Invading Spain was not wise, but Villèle was not thinking strategically. He was only thinking about his narrow political interests. Sharing a border with liberal Spain was not an existential threat to France. It did not require a military intervention, but it was politically inconvenient for France's ultra-conservative faction, so they invaded anyways. You'd think that the decision to invade a country for political reasons would spark a lively debate in the French legislature, but it didn't. The legislature was 85% ultra-conservative, and with the new rigged voting system, nobody in the government was particularly worried about the next election. Everybody just mindlessly went along with Villèle and the king. The fact that this dramatically increased the chance of a world war, a great power conflict, didn't bother any of them. That was far less important to them than their goofy ultra-conservative ideology. It's worth repeating that
That is, I don't know how to. I don't know what to say. Like, wait, I'm gonna let this
people
continue.
were not on board with this. The ultra-conservatives had never been popular. They only dominated the legislature because the elections had been rigged to favor them. The people favored the liberals and the Republicans. The centrist liberals hated the invasion for obvious reasons. The Spanish liberals were their ideological brothers. The left-wing Republicans hated it too. The Spanish Constitution had been the invention of their beloved Emperor Napoleon. To the millions of Frenchmen who had at one time served under him, the thought of invading another country just to undo the work of Napoleon was unthinkable. But none of that opposition mattered.
That is so intriguing to me. Like this whole interesting dynamic relationship between Spain and France, because Spain is still Bourbon to this day, isn't it? Yeah, I'm pretty sure Spain is still Bourbon to this day. That's this is a very, I don't know how else to describe it other than intriguing. But I like it though. I like this weird dynamic relationship going on right now.
The invasion of Spain went ahead anyways, and in the next French election, 96% of the seats went to the ultra-conservatives.
Oh my
Now,
gosh.
there was virtually no domestic political opposition to whatever Villèle and the King of France wanted to do. But I'll say it again. There was plenty of opposition out on the streets. It's just that the political system had been designed so that none of those people were allowed to participate in politics anymore.
And this is the, oh freaking hell, hold on a sec. Yeah, this is the problem with representative democracy, is that if you can have a democracy, bro, it should just be direct democracy, not representative democracy. No, like the whole idea of one person representing millions of people, that's no.
Shortly after this, King Louis XVIII, the man who had been restored to the throne after the fall of Napoleon, died. He was succeeded by his younger brother, a much more autocratic and conservative man.
Holy moly.
Under King Charles,
look at this man,
ultra-conservative Prime Minister Villèle, liberals and Republicans working within the government were purged. Purged is such a heavy word. They were fired. They weren't killed. Villèle then began to systematically roll back the reforms of the French Revolution in an effort to return France to an 18th century political mindset.
I don't think that's gonna work.
Had promised to never do this, and that promise had kept the peace in France for the last 9 years. The new king did not feel bound by that promise.
Oh.
That none of these moves were popular, and the people weren't afraid to let him know. Public outcry reached a fever pitch, and in order to insulate the government from any further criticism, Villèle clamped down on the liberal press with heavy censorship laws. Again, maybe if I ignore my problems, they'll just go away.
I want to see how this ends.
It soon became clear that the new king had a pretty old-fashioned attitude when it came to his prime minister.
Bro, I
At the
can't.
beginning of each year, the king
Look at how he looks, dude. My goodness.
gave Villèle a list of priorities, and it was Villèle's job throughout the year to simply make everything on that list a law. It was like the king was his own prime minister, and Villèle was his little assistant or something. Under such a system, it's not clear what the purpose of elections would even be. There's not really any point if the king's just gonna personally dominate the legislature no matter what. I frankly don't understand why Villèle tolerated being humiliated in this way, but I guess it was the logical conclusion of his extreme ultra-conservative ideology. One of the things that the king ordered Villèle to do was compensate the aristocracy for the loss of their land during the revolution. The land was long gone, so what Villèle had to do was pay the rich by taxing the poor. It was exactly as popular with the people as you might imagine. The new taxes weren't even sufficient, so France had to plunge itself deeply into debt in order to finance this scheme. And for what? Just to re-establish the supremacy of the French aristocracy.
Oh my gosh. So, I did a video, like, what was it? I think 2 days ago now, where someone, I don't know, it was basically like a Russia reaction video. I kind of like pointed out there how it's funny how like a lot of people like to bash Russia for having like elites and having like a poor class or whatever, which is kind of wrong. But I say kind of because it's kind of true, but it's like everyone ignores the fact that throughout history, the West hasn't really been any different. Me watching this, I'm like thinking about what I said and like the double standards that everyone has. I'm like thinking to myself, wait a minute. Imagine if this is like Russia right now. Like everybody would be literally like just bashing Russia to the max, calling it out to the core, right? But because it's France, the rich and the elite class, had a few problems and the people didn't like it. Nobody knows, right? Everybody, just overlooks that, of course. Like, I mean, if you like history, you'll probably know about this, but for the most part, no. But if it was Russia, everybody would remember this to the ends of earth. It's ridiculous, dude.
The country was politically unstable, and the poor were still struggling to find enough to eat. The king's political instincts were all out of whack.
So like, and this is like what, 1820? This is around the same time as the. Oh my gosh!
Election.
I'm not even gonna say. I'm gonna save that for another video.
Important, but he didn't care about actual elections. As the years passed, the king and Villèle continued their politically unpopular ultra-conservative crusade, which had the unintended, but in my opinion, obvious side effect of making France incredibly politically unstable. In 1827, as the king was performing a routine inspection of the Paris National Guard, the guardsmen surprised him with impromptu cries of "Down with Villèle." When officers tried to establish order, one guardsman decided to go down in history as an absolute legend and punched his superior officer in the face right in front of the king. Pretty soon, the officers completely lost control of the men.
Oh my gosh. Okay, that is legendary. Oh, that's actually legendary. What?
They were able to stop another guardsman from breaking ranks and screaming treasonous stuff right in the king's face. It was a wake-up call for the ultra-conservatives. The next day, Villèle's government disbanded the Paris National Guard.
Oh well.
The backlash was here, and even the rank and file were coming out openly against the king.
And that's when you know that you're screwed. When the military turns against you, you're screwed, pal. And guys, this is literally why I always say in my videos that talks about like democracy and all that stuff. I'm like, I wouldn't really care if a country's a dictatorship as long as the people are, improving. Who cares, right? Because in cases like these, bro, like, yeah, sure, they'll have the military and whatnot, but guys, a dictatorship can fail. A dictatorship can fail. Trust me. Even if you're a dictator, like you very much have to or if you're authoritarian, you very much still have to consider what people say, especially your military. Not that his military is turning against him. Oh well, that's it. GG's. That's that. It's over. And even then, it's like, even if you have the military, the people can still get weapons by God knows how. But it can happen. Case in point would be, you know, I don't want to say that country's name, but the country who recently just got overthrown in the Middle East in that civil war, right? It was authoritarian, but guess what? The people went and rose up and got rid of it. So this is why I low-key support authoritarian governments or just straight up dictatorships, because it's like, when stuff isn't going well, you know who to blame. You know who to blame and where the problem is. You can just easily get rid of that person and replace him with someone else, right? So that's just me, though. If you don't like dictatorships and authoritarianism, that's fine. But I'm just saying, like, you know, if, like, I don't know, like, America had to turn into a dictatorship, it's like, I wouldn't really care unless things got really bad. Obviously, then that's when everybody would care, you know?
Villèle thought that this might just be the beginning of a period of unpopularity for the government, and so he advised the king to call an early election so that they could lock in their legislative majority for the next 7 years. Yes, they had been working tirelessly this entire time to make elections as infrequent as possible. When we started this story, there was an election every year. Now there was an election every 7 years. If he locked in a legislative majority now, Villèle hoped that all of his autocratic reforms would be done within the next 7 years. And after that, maybe he wouldn't have to worry about elections at all anymore. The Liberal and Republican opposition groups saw this as an existential crisis. They feared that in 7 years' time, this may all be gone, and that this may literally be the last French election. The electoral system was still rigged against the opposition, but nevertheless, the Liberals and the Republicans threw every resource they had into rallying public opinion and coming out in force. Here were the results of the 1827 French election. 46% of the seats went to a coalition of Liberal and Republican opposition groups. 45% of the seats went to Villèle's ultra-conservative government coalition. 7% of the seats went to a conservative group that opposed Villèle's government. Under the rigged electoral system, the Liberal opposition groups unexpectedly won the most seats. They were ecstatic. The king and Villèle had made a historic blunder. To make matters worse, it quickly became clear that all of these groups hated each other, and so nobody was able to put together a governing majority. The king was now stuck with a deadlocked legislature.
Well, that's how it should be. That's how it should be. In a healthy, functioning democracy, that's how it should be, in my personal opinion.
For the next 7 years. The king fired Villèle and selected a new ultra-conservative prime minister who believed that they could find compromises with the Liberals. But the Liberals and the other opposition groups were high on their electoral victory and out for blood, so none of them would agree to work with any ultra-conservative prime minister. If the king really wanted to work with the Liberals, then he should select a Liberal prime minister. But he didn't. Over the next year and a half, the legislature accomplished virtually nothing. Eventually, the king grew frustrated and fired his failed compromise prime minister in favor of somebody who actually shared his politics. In 1829, he appointed an extreme right-wing ultra-conservative named Napoleonic as prime minister. If a compromise ultra-conservative...
What type of polling? What? That's an L. Okay, whatever. I'm not. No.
And an extreme ultra-conservative definitely would neither. But the king no longer cared. He just wanted somebody who shared his views to start pushing people around. Just to give you a sense of how extreme this new prime minister was, during the Napoleonic Wars, he was implicated in an attempt to assassinate the emperor and was imprisoned for 9 years.
Whoa!
After the king was restored to the throne, Polignac's political right-hand man argued for rounding up Napoleon's supporters and putting them to death. The liberal opposition groups.
Oh my gosh. Woo! Okay. Let's see what this guy is like.
In particular, their Republican allies were justifiably alarmed that the king would allow men like this to get anywhere near government.
Yeah,
In
bro.
addition to all
This reminds me of a certain group in a certain Middle Eastern country.
of this, the king was sending an undeniable signal with this appointment. He was signaling that it did not particularly matter what the results of the election were, since he was perfectly comfortable running everything through his unelected and unrepresentative prime minister. Perhaps a taste of what the future of France may look like.
Moral of the story: Napoleon was the best choice, and the French Revolution.
King Charles
The French Revolution was all basically in vain.
decided to invade Algeria.
Oh my gosh! And the French people should have fought with Napoleon when he needed them most, even if they were sick and tired of war. I find that so funny because when I reacted to Napoleon's downfall by Epic History TV, go check it out if you haven't checked it out. And I pointed out how the French people were so-called sick and tired of war and all that stuff. I'm like, you guys were the one who started the revolution. Napoleon just so happened to be the guy who, you know, just was there to fix all your problems. Debatably. Well, he did fix a lot of problems, don't get me wrong. Even though he rigged a whole bunch of things, he did fix a lot of problems and, well, imposed the revolutionary ideals that the French people wanted. I guess you could say that. So when I'm like hearing all this, I'm like, well, yeah, what do you expect? And not only that, I'm just like, this is what I'm saying. Like, you want to complain when you started the revolution? Napoleon came, solved your problems. Then when he needed you most, now you want to say, oh, I'm tired of this. But then when Napoleon gets deposed, he's dead now. And now this is happening. Now you want to complain again. Like, what were you expecting, man? And it has so many people who were saying, oh, you're so dumb. Because I said that the French people were weak because they didn't fight for something that they caused. Yes, I know that there were a bunch of loyalists who were loyal to the crown, but I'm just saying, like, you know, like, come on, let's not be a nerd emoji right now. You know exactly what I'm saying. Let's not be too literal.
He had some pretext for this, but the pretext doesn't really matter.
Ooh, Algeria.
France lost virtually all of its colonies after its defeat at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And the king felt that establishing a new colony in Algeria would restore French prestige. I would just ask you, is this a good reason to establish a colony? What would our beloved George Canning say about this? Canning had argued that colonies were only useful insofar as they facilitated trade. I don't recall him saying anything about making the king feel better about past humiliations. You will see this argument made time and time again by mediocre men in the 19th century. They will become obsessed with how colonies look on a map, and then will use the map to justify the policy. But the point of colonies cannot be how they look on a map. The map is an abstraction, a theoretical tool. They're not real. What's real is conditions on the ground. What would the invasion of Algeria do to improve the material conditions in France? Nothing. In fact, it was worse than nothing. France would have to send 20% of its army overseas. It was France's second unnecessary invasion in only 7 years. It destroyed France's military readiness for basically no reason. If there was a crisis in Europe, France would find it difficult to respond. It was a risky plan. Furthermore, France didn't really have any money, and this invasion would impose a massive financial burden. Remember, France was still taxing the poor so that they could give money to the rich. Any additional taxes to finance this reckless invasion would be met with hostility. But King Charles and Prime Minister Polignac wanted to do it, and so they just did it.
What in the world?
In 1830,
Oh,
King opened
okay, I thought
that
it
year's
froze.
deadlocked legislature by proposing a relatively modest set of programs. But many politicians found the way that he opened the session alarming. He seemed to subtly threaten violence if any of them stood in the way of his legislation. He even hinted that he may act without the approval of the legislature, if necessary, describing himself as the true representative of the people, not the elected legislature.
Bro, you're tripping.
It was a real
tripping.
mask-off moment for the king.
You're literally tripping,
Even
man.
His own ultra-conservatives were bothered. A couple of weeks later, the liberal opposition in the legislature were able to gather enough support to push back against the king. They sent a letter to the king and told him that from now on, the king's ministers, including the prime minister, must have the support of the legislature. The king couldn't just appoint whomever he wished. Elections had to mean something. King Charles was incensed by what he perceived to be a direct
Bro, when you say King Charles, I thought about the current King Charles. Oh my gosh.
to his power. He accused the liberals of trying to overthrow the government. He decided that he could not work with these people and immediately dissolved the legislature and called a new election. According to his own electoral reforms, this was 4 years ahead of schedule, but given the current political climate, the liberal opposition was likely to get stronger in the short term, not weaker. And so he
You know, it's so weird to me how, like, I'm pretty sure the British monarch can dissolve parliament if that person so wishes. I'm pretty sure they can do that. Don't know much info on it, but I always find that relationship dynamic between like parliament and the monarch in any given country that has that whole system is like parliament is passing all these laws, but like the monarch is just there, like especially in the constitutional monarchy, is like the monarch isn't supposed to have power, but yet that same monarch can go and dissolve parliament. I always say that was BS, to be honest. Like in the constitutional monarchy, well, it's constitutional monarchy. Like in Britain, monarch still very much has power. They're just brought up to not exercise it unless push really comes to shove.
thought that he would need a friendly legislature to get him through the coming storm. Elections were scheduled to begin in late June. The date was not an accident. The French army was scheduled to land in Algeria in early June, so the thought was that by the end of the month, there would probably be some good news to bolster support for the ultra-conservatives. One politician begged Prime Minister Polignac to keep the legislature in session all the way up until the election, because he believed that he could cobble together a small working majority of moderates from different factions. Polignac responded, "A majority? That would really cause me problems. I wouldn't know what to do with it." Kind of a shocking thing for a politician to say out loud, but it really shows how Polignac and the king weren't really interested in liberal democracy at all. The ultra-conservative faction was really lost at sea at this point. They only cared about investing more and more power into the king and the aristocracy, and very little about any other people or institutions. Polignac wasn't even particularly interested in popular support. What he wanted to do was make elections no longer matter. We must now talk about Article 14 of France's Constitution, also known as the Charter. History will hang on the wording of Article 14, so let me just give you the whole thing up front. The king is the supreme head of state, commands the land and the sea forces, declares war, makes treaties of peace, alliances, and commerce, appoints to all places of public administration, and makes the necessary regulations and ordinances for the execution of the laws and the security of the state.
Now, reading this as somebody who supports monarchy, and there's a bunch of people, particularly Americans, who are like to cocksuck democracy. Me personally, how I feel about this, I know this is the French constitution, even though France isn't a monarchy anymore. There is literally nothing wrong with this. Sure, you can say, oh, but the king could be tyrannical. Guys, in a represented democracy, or in just a democracy in general, really and truly, the problem with democracy is that you have a date. You have a date coming, and most of the people who are elected, they don't really, because of that, they don't really bother to like do what needs to be done. They're just too busy worried about the next election date. Oh, am I gonna get reelected? Or oh, what can I do for myself before I get out of office and lose power? All that stuff. Like, the only real argument that I've heard against monarchy is literally like,
monarchy is tyrannical and they can censor stuff and they can oppress the people and bad, like.
That's the only real good argument. Everything else is kind of like meh.
Let's break it down. The king is the head of the state. He commands the military, runs foreign policy, and appoints all the ministers. That's all very straightforward. But then, there's this funny bit at the end. And makes the necessary regulations and ordinances for the execution of the laws and the security of the state. Regulations and ordinances. That basically means laws, right? And makes the necessary laws for the security of the state. Huh. You see what this is, don't you? If the king pressed a giant red button that said, "This is a security matter," he could institute any regulation or law that he wished. Who got to decide what was a security matter? The king. It was a giant loophole in the middle of the French Constitution that could theoretically grant the king unlimited power in the name of security. The king's supporters, in the ultra-conservatives, began to argue that the unruly liberal opposition to the king was a security matter, and if the upcoming election tipped in the liberal direction, the king could use Article 14 to overturn it. Nobody had ever done anything like this before. Even the ultra-conservatives were split on whether it would even be legal. But the ultra-conservatives didn't need to agree. Only the king needed to agree.
Yeah, let's hear what he has to say.
After some consideration, the king spoke to his closest ministers. If the upcoming election results were not to his liking, he said, then he would, quote, make his prerogative respected. The king was not being explicit, but everybody took his meaning. One way or another, the liberal opposition would be out of power after the next election. The French army landed in Algeria in early June, and 10 days later they won their first significant victory. All according to plan.
So we got to learn about the colonization of Algeria, okay.
The king decided to make a big public spectacle of attending mass, to beef up his religious credibility on the eve of the election. As expected, large crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the king as he made his way through the streets. But there was no cheering. No waving.
I knew it.
Crowds just stood there, eerily silent, watching the king like a pack of hungry wolves.
Oh, that's awkward. That's really. I would be terrified to be in that position. Oh my
Began shortly after
goodness.
this, and then wrapped up in the third week of July. The feeling going into the election was that it might be close. It wasn't close. 65% of the legislative seats went to the Liberal and Republican opposition. 32% of the seats went to the King's ultra-conservatives. The rest went to smaller groups that also opposed Polignac's government. A massive victory for the Liberals. The king and his ultra-conservative allies met to decide what to do about the election results. Discussion centered around Article 14 of the Charter.
Use it. I want to see if he uses it.
That the Liberals in the legislature were a semi-treasonous faction. Then the king had the authority under Article 14 of the Charter to make the necessary laws for the security of the state. After much debate, the king decided to invoke Article 14 and use it to do 4 things. These would later become known as the 4 Ordinances. 1. Dissolve the newly elected Liberal majority legislature. 2. Reform the French electoral system and make it pretty much impossible for the Liberals to ever win again. 3. Immediately hold new elections under this new electoral system and allow the ultra-conservatives to win pretty much every seat. 4. Suspend freedom of the press and shut down the liberal newspapers, who the king blamed for his drop in popularity and the unexpected election results.
Now, here's the thing, right? When it comes to that whole press and the media, I do get it when this oh my gosh, this is such a weird one, because on one hand it's like, I get it if someone wouldn't want the media talking about them. Like, people are very gullible and it's very easy to just write something, and just a lot of people would just don't think for themselves. They just fall for it, take it at face value. So anytime I hear like a dictator is like completely censoring like the press and the media and whatnot, I'm like, okay, I get that. But then on the other hand, it's like, what if that person actually does something that actually needs to be covered? You know what I mean? So it's just weird. It's like, it goes hand in hand. Like, oh my gosh, dude, you can argue for both, really and truly. That's really hard to think about. Like, freedom of the press, you could easily slander someone's name, and because of that, I mean, that's why Trump lost. Not this election, he won this, but the previous election before, because the media and press just painted him out as a bad dude, and people just fell for it. They didn't do their own research and whatnot. So it's like, I don't know, man. Like, it's very easy to slander someone's name, but I don't know. Tell me your thoughts.
That's right, it was the newspaper's fault, not the 10 years of unpopular policies. The king's cousin, Louis Philippe, was not informed that the king was taking this step. He learned of the 4 ordinances by reading about it in the newspaper. Louis Philippe was more friendly to the liberals than his cousin the king was, and when he read what the king had done, he told his wife, "They've done it. They've mounted a coup d'etat." Later that day, he hosted a large group of mostly liberal supporters at his home, and quite naturally, the king's 4 ordinances were all anybody could talk about. In front of all these people, the usually careful Louis Philippe lost his composure and shouted, "They're mad! They'll get themselves exiled again!" His liberal supporters urged him to come to Paris and throw his support behind the liberal opposition. Louis Philippe told them no. He wouldn't openly go against the king. For the time being, he would do nothing.
I'm really curious to see how this is gonna end. Like, how
in Paris,
this is like a movie.
Not taking this
Oh my goodness!
One paper famously wrote, "The legal regime is now interrupted. That of force has begun. In this situation, obedience ceases to be a duty. Later continuing, France must judge how far it ought to take its resistance. They were coming just a hair shy of openly calling for revolution. That evening, soldiers tried to shut down one of the many liberal newspapers that were continuing to operate in violation of the king's new censorship law. This attracted a crowd who began taunting the soldiers with cries of "Down with the Bourbons" and "Long live the Charter." The soldiers tried to suppress the crowd, but it quickly turned into a riot, with mobs roaming the streets and smashing street lamps. By pure chance, one of these mobs stumbled across Prime Minister Napoleonic and his Minister of the Navy as they were leaving a cabinet meeting. The mob closed in and started pelting the two with rocks. The politicians narrowly escaped the mob by jumping into a nearby carriage, but not before the Minister of the Navy was badly injured. Somehow, the French Navy managed to lose a battle on the streets of Paris. They really weren't safe anywhere.
Oh, come on. You really had to do that dad joke.
Imagine.
On July 27th, thousands of soldiers were sent to shut down the liberal opposition newspapers, which led to widespread protests across Paris. First, the soldiers tried to escalate things by charging one of the crowds on horseback, which didn't work. Later, they tried to escalate further by firing indiscriminately into the crowd. 21 were killed and scores were wounded. As the sun went down on a violent day, some new revolutionary slogans were heard in the protests. "Down with the aristocrats! Death to the ministers!" Only 24 hours ago, these had been liberal crowds who had been protesting for constitutionalism and a free press. Now they were revolutionary crowds, and they wanted to overthrow the government.
Again!
Violence had
Okay.
only radicalized the people.
I mean, what do you expect? Why in the world was the king literally expecting,
day,
bro?
crowds were-
At this point, I'm just like, oh well, French Revolution 2.0 question mark. I am all for it. that's why I'm just sitting here just watching to see how this is gonna end, bro. Hey, bro. Again, this is like a movie. It's
larger. The man in charge of defending Paris at this time was Major General Marmont, and he had a hell of a problem on his hands. His garrison
Marmont. Oh my gosh, Marmont. Oh my gosh, I love it, Marmont. We get to see one of Napoleon's old comrades in action again. Oh my gosh. Oh, that's amazing. I want to see more of Napoleon's old comrades in action.
in Paris had been hollowed out for the Algerian campaign, and of those that remained, most of the higher-ranking officers had been sent home so that they could vote for the ultra-conservatives in the upcoming election. Marmont's garrison was not in any way prepared for what they were about to encounter. At noon, Marmont moved into Paris with the aim of occupying key bridges and public squares, where the protests had been the strongest. What they found when they entered the city was totally unexpected. Within the last 24 hours, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars had grabbed their dusty old muskets and gone over to help the protesters. The veterans had each adopted groups of protesters, and in only a day, they taught them a few tricks. As Marmont's soldiers advanced through the streets, they ran into thousands, yes, thousands, of barricades. These were tall defensive structures, built out of ripped-up cobblestones and furniture, and wagons and parts of buildings, and anything else that the protesters could get their hands on.
Mind blown.
Taller ones could be 3 meters high, which for the Americans in the audience is approximately learn how long a meter is high. Quite high.
Learn how long a meter is.
The old veterans instructed the protesters not only to build the barricades, but also to occupy the buildings on each side of the streets approaching the barricades, so that any enemy soldiers would be hit with musket fire from 3 directions.
Oh
They also
no.
loaded up the buildings with cobblestones and roof tiles and other things that unarmed protesters could hurl down at the soldiers. Let's not be cute. By other things, I mean human excrement. As groups of soldiers
that's disgusting. Oh my, what is this, India now? Oh, I'm sorry, I had to make that joke, bro.
Advanced into the city. They bumped into barricades that hadn't been there last night. When they turned around, they bumped into new barricades that hadn't been there a few hours earlier. It was like being trapped in a maze, but the walls kept shifting, and also somebody kept dumping human excrement into it. Marmont had not thought to send his soldiers into the
so
city
nasty.
with supplies, and so the whole garrison spent 8 or more hours covered in filth, frantically marching in circles with no food or water. Morale was at an all-time low. A great many soldiers either surrendered to the protesters or defected.
Marmont, Napoleon is disappointed in you. Napoleon looking down on you from heaven. He's like, Marmont, come on, Marmont. Oh my gosh, Marmont.
As the sun began to set, many of the soldiers had to make direct assaults on the barricades just to escape the city and make it back to camp. Late in the day, the liberal opposition opened negotiations with Marmont. They told him that as a precondition to any talks, the king must revoke the 4 ordinances. Marmont expressed his sympathy and agreed to take their demand directly to Prime Minister Polignac. The Prime Minister flatly rejected this preliminary demand and told Marmont that there would not be any further meetings with the delegates. Marmont was stunned at his response and decided to take the highly unorthodox step of writing to the king personally. He wrote, "This is no longer a riot, it is a revolution." Continuing,
Come on, Marmont.
"I think it is urgent that your majesty profit without delay from the overtures that are made to him. The honor of the crown can still be saved. Tomorrow, perhaps it will be too late. I am taking measures to pacify the revolt. The troops will be ready at noon, but I await with impatience your majesty's orders." To be clear,
How in the world you go from Napoleon, a literal emperor, conqueror of Europe, to doing this for a simple king of France? Imagine going from that to that. I don't know how to feel. That's so surreal. It just feels weird to me that this is the same Marmont who was with Napoleon in Italy, and it's just weird. I don't know, man. Or maybe I'm just too tired. Am I too tired? No, this is just so weird. Like, damn, like, yo, this is one of Napoleon's comrades here now serving the king of France. Not even serving like the French Empire. He's just serving France. And a king, not emperor. Like, oh, that's so odd.
this was way out of line. This was a local military officer going around the prime minister so that he could advise the king on political matters. But Marmont was desperate, and nobody above him seemed to be taking the situation seriously. The king wrote back and basically told Marmont to hold steady. Marmont's pleas had fallen on deaf ears.
Oh, poor Marmont. Oh man,
Marmont pulled back to a defensive position. He wouldn't be tricked into another costly engagement like yesterday. Almost immediately, 15 or 20% of Marmont's 12,000 soldiers defected and went over to join the protesters.
Absolutely
In order
brutal.
to fill the holes in his defensive position, Marmont ordered his men to pull back into an even tighter circle, which the soldiers incorrectly interpreted as a retreat, which triggered a chain reaction of even more defections. By noon, the defections were totally out of control, and in order to stem the losses, the king fired Marmont and ordered the garrison to withdraw from the city, turning a false retreat into a real one.
Marmont has always just been so unlucky, man. Poor Marmont, dude. Ever since the Napoleonic Wars, he's just not
Protesters
been
had
lucky.
captured Paris. The whole thing only took 3 days.
We only got the capital, but they're not Versailles, so. Let's see.
And Talleyrand, who had lost faith in the king and had been helping to guide the liberal opposition from behind the scenes, was perhaps the first person to fully understand the significance of this. As he and his political allies watched the soldiers leaving the city, he took out his pocket watch and declared, 29th of July, 5 minutes past midday. The elder branch of the House of Bourbon has ceased to reign.
Talleyrand is such a snake.
The liberal opposition was blown away at their own
Shaking my
success.
head.
They had been fighting to overturn the 4 ordinances and squeeze some political concessions out of the king. And now, without even really intending to do so, they had overthrown the monarchy. That evening, the king finally tried to negotiate. If he had done that yesterday when Marmont asked him to, it may have helped. But now it was too late.
Yeah.
The liberals controlled Paris, and they got to decide.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, man. Like, basically, they control the heart of the country
Next
now.
day, the liberals and their Republican allies were locked in a heated internal debate. Some argued for using their new position to overthrow the entire system, while others urged caution. The other great powers were monitoring the situation in France carefully, and if they caught even a whiff of something resembling the French Revolution, most of them were prepared to march into France to stop it.
Yeah, I can't
That's how
make
you
that
get a
same
world
mistake
war.
again.
As if to drive this point home, as the liberal opposition gathered to debate their next move, they could hear cries of "Long live Napoleon" coming from the streets. The people were in a dangerous mood. They seemed fully prepared to do the whole French Revolution over again.
Exactly.
Although
Let me
must be
see
said,
it. I
the
want
crowd
to
was a
see
little
it.
misguided in their sloganeering. Napoleon was dead. He wasn't long living nothing.
No, yeah, that's true.
The liberals
That's true. He's long dead at this. Well, he's been dead for like what, 15 years, I think. I don't even know. But
finally figured out what their demands would be. They demanded that King Charles be removed from power and that France transition to a limited constitutional monarchy, kind of modeled after Great Britain. This,
That's not gonna-
they believed, would be just radical enough to satisfy
That's
the
not-
Republicans and prevent a civil war.
That's
but
not gonna-
so radical that it would free
that constitutional monarchy isn't gonna be jack. I've reacted this enough. It's not gonna be jack.
freak out the other great powers and trigger a world war. The problem was figuring out who to replace the king with. Some of the more radical Republicans suggested Napoleon's 19-year-old son, but that idea was dismissed out of hand. Remember, they were trying to not freak out the other great powers. Others suggested the king's 9-year-old grandson, Henry, or Henri, I guess. But the mainstream liberals rejected this, over fears that the tyrant King Charles would continue to wield power from behind the scenes.
Yeah, just influence
They
him.
settled
Yep.
on the one person that they could all agree on, the king's 56-year-old cousin, Louis Philippe.
Oh yeah, I forgot he was
Liberal
he
politicians,
was there. I forgot
by
about him.
far the largest part of the coalition of opposition groups, strongly favored Louis Philippe, as it was widely known that he was a closet liberal. The more conservative members of the group felt that they could hold their noses and back Louis Philippe, since they could rest easy knowing that the monarchy would survive. The radical Republicans, who were initially pushing for Napoleon's son, also felt that they could hold their noses and get behind Louis Philippe.
Okay, so everyone
What made
is
Louis
finally
Philippe
in agreement.
was that he had fought with distinction in the Republican army. That was a big deal to the veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. He may have been royalty, but in a way he was one of them.
That's actually quite
It was
cool.
also noteworthy to the
I never knew that. That's actually really awesome.
veterans that even after circumstances forced him to flee France, Louis Philippe never took up arms against his own country. Many exiled aristocrats did, but Louis Philippe always
Never
refused.
did.
That was a
Okay.
big deal.
Based.
So it seemed that Louis Philippe was the only candidate for king that could unite the liberal, conservative, and republican factions and prevent a civil war, at least for now. By the evening of July 30th, Louis Philippe was on his way to Paris. It wasn't official yet, but the reign of King Charles X was effectively over. When Louis Philippe entered Paris, he was greeted with cries of "Long live the Republic!" This was a bit of a problem. The people of Paris had been radicalized by the violence of the last 5 days. Yes, it had only been 5 days, and they might not be okay with the monarchy surviving at all. Louis Philippe had to perform a difficult balancing act. He made an effort to reach out to all of Napoleon's old generals, and made sure to appear with them publicly, alongside symbols of the revolution, like the tricolor flag. He had to somehow communicate, "I am basically on your side," while also making it clear that he was not re-establishing the Republic. His outreach worked. The people of Paris rallied behind Louis Philippe, and a couple of days later, Charles X abdicated the throne. The July Revolution was complete.
That's a very interesting
In 1830, France got off lucky. There should have been a civil war, but there wasn't. There should have been an invasion by France's conservative neighbors,
wanted another war.
There wasn't. The liberals and their new king, Louis Philippe, somehow managed to thread the needle and preserve the peace. Austria was quick to recognize the new government in France. Metternich had been busy behind the scenes, reassuring the great powers that Louis Philippe would be a perfectly acceptable king. And with him in charge, they had no reason to worry about the July Revolution spinning out of control. He was right.
And this is why, like I said, I support authoritarianism or just monarchy in general, because it's like if that person in charge sucks, eventually you could just go and replace him, quite frankly speaking.
August 3rd, Louis Philippe reopened.
Like, I believe that authoritarianism should be a thing, or a monarchy should be a thing, but there should be a written constitutional like amendment law, whatever the heck, that basically states if this person in power is too bad or whatever the heck, I don't know, it's like 3 a.m. But like in a nutshell, this person is just really bad and people try to replace him, like the people have every right to replace him if he's extremely bad, right? If things get really bad or he tries to go too far with his power for his own personal gain and glory, he's not working for the state. Like, the people have every right to pick up arms and replace him. And if he tries to abolish an amendment or remove that amendment, then the people have every right to go and, you know, remove him. Something like that, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, you know.
Opened the legislature and proposed a set of liberal reforms, including eliminating the loophole in Article 14 of the Charter that allowed the king to seize power in the name of security. All of these reforms were popular and they passed easily. The old charter had stated that the king was the sole source of sovereignty. Now, sovereignty was shared between the king and the legislature. Politicians could now write their own legislation without first getting the approval of the king. Ministers were still approved by the king, but now they could be removed by the legislature. The old censorship law was scrapped. The size of the electorate was increased by 75%. It wasn't what Republicans would have asked for. The only people allowed to vote were still a small, wealthy minority. But it was a step in the right direction.
Of course. Why am I not surprised?
1830 was a turning point for Europe. The liberals pulled off a relatively bloodless revolution in France, but it was also part of a wider trend in Europe of liberals finally rising up against the authoritarian status quo. Portugal, Spain, Belgium, Switzerland, Northern Italy, the German Confederation, and Poland all saw liberal uprisings of some kind. Some were successful, some were not, but the larger point is that the post-war conservative order was crumbling, and a new period of liberal ascendancy was beginning. The liberal victories brought about a profound change in the political left in Europe. Before 1830, the moderate liberals and the radical republicans were united in their opposition to the conservatives in power. As the liberals came to power in France and elsewhere, it exposed rifts in their coalition. In the words of Eric Hobsbawm, after 1830, liberalism and democracy appeared to be adversaries rather than allies.
Well, yeah, that's to be expected. Once the goal is accomplished, it's like, wait, why are we allies again? Oh, we don't have a reason to be allies anymore. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, we have different ideals. Oh. Yeah, I literally expected that. That's nothing crazy.
Tocqueville was a big-time defender of liberal France in the 1830s and viewed the Republican left with a lot of suspicion. He wrote of the split, quote, "From the 18th century there flows two rivers. One carries men to free institutions, the other to absolute power. Liberalism, in his view, brought with it free institutions. Republicanism, in his view, brought with it mob rule and chaos, which naturally led, in his view, to absolute power and emperors." Not only did 1830 split the liberals and the Republicans, but it also split the East and the West. Liberalism triumphed over authoritarianism in France, Britain, and Belgium, which meant that Western Europe became a sort of liberal bloc. Portugal and Spain were doing their own thing, but they were so weak and consumed with internal conflict that they couldn't challenge their liberal neighbors. Eastern Europe had mostly suppressed their liberal revolts, making them a kind of conservative bloc, where monarchies continued to dominate political life. The interesting thing about France in 1830 is that it provides a sobering example of what happens when conservative governments try to freeze out even incremental progress and liberal institutions. This all could have been avoided if, at any time during the preceding 10 years, France had just allowed the liberals to win an election. That's what elections are.
Yeah, I really don't understand what in the world France is doing. Like, I don't really think it would have taken a genius to like realize that just let the liberals win one election, But
if the liberals in France could have got into government and passed some reforms, it would have let off enough steam to avoid the July Revolution.
Yeah.
But instead of doing that, the French ultra-conservatives in the 1820s sabotaged all of the release valves in order to suit their own short-term political aims. Demand for reform reached such intensity that the liberals were willing to do anything in order to achieve it. As a result, the king was overthrown, and the ultra-conservatives were swept out of power in France forever. The ultra-conservatives were so hell-bent on preventing any liberal reforms whatsoever that they lost everything. The same factors that produced the July Revolution in France were at work all across Europe. Some governments were overthrown, some were not, but every government had to figure out how to weather the same storm. No country did a better job at weathering the storm than Britain. Why? Because unlike so many of their peer nations, Britain decided to allow their disputes to be resolved through politics. The election of 1830, which was coincidentally called on the same day that the French liberals captured Paris, unleashed the greatest period of legislative productivity in Britain in 100 years. The British liberals accomplished some great things, including something that up until now was thought to be impossible. Something that would change the world forever. They abolished slavery in the British Empire.
Oh, yes. Slavery. Yes, of course, slavery. A very big deal in Britain. I don't know if he's going to talk about that. Is he going to talk about that? Wait. I guess he's gonna talk about that in a different video, but I'm not even gonna talk about slavery here, man, because this video is more about France. Look, dude, you made it all the way to the end of the video. I don't find it interesting how he says that everyone finds it impossible that slavery would be abolished. I already think that was impossible. Many places tried to do it, but then again, tried but failed. Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah, I can see why you would say that would be impossible. But you made it all the way to the end, man. If you like what I have to say in my videos, make sure you like and subscribe. If you have any suggestions, go and comment down below. Eventually, I will do your suggestion in the future. Go check out my other reactions on my channel, and go check out my Napoleonic Wars or my Epic History TV 18, I forgot what the heck was it, 1848. Yeah, 1848 revolution, all that fun stuff, man. Thank you for watching and goodbye.